At least 20,000 Canadians took up arms to fight in the U.S. Civil War. While following that conflict, many enslaved people found their way to Canada via the Underground Railroad. But journalist Brian Martin also found that many plantation owners, Confederate generals, and even Ku Klux members also came to the Great White North, and it's talked about in this book, From Underground Railroad to Rebel Refuge. Brian, this isn't really a part of our history that is talked about much.
Well, I agree. I think there's a tendency among Canadians to think of the Civil War as the Americans' big problem, that it was their struggle. We had a front row seat to this terrible, terrible struggle just a few miles away from us, and we became involved in it, whether we wanted to be involved in it or not. Beforehand, Black people fleeing slavery came here in large numbers. Some settled in existing communities, some settled in communities they established themselves. During the war, we had buyers. London, where I'm speaking to you from, my hometown here, was selling to both sides of the Civil War. We had buyers buying horses and foodstuffs and materials and guns and all sorts of things for both sides. We had spies. We had draft dodgers showed up here. They were known as skedaddlers. That was during the war. There was a Confederate plot of $600,000 based in Toronto and Montreal to undermine the North from those bases, and they caused all sorts of trouble to the North because they wanted to attract attention away from the Southern Front, where the South was losing so badly. After the war, we had people that used to enslave people and own plantations that came up here. We've got several headstones of them here in London. Plus, we had Confederate generals and other officials of the Confederacy, including Jefferson Davis, that came to Canada and stayed a time. He even came to Niagara-on-the-Lake. Niagara-on-the-Lake was a very popular spot for Confederate generals and other leaders, including the last Secretary of War, John Breckinridge. It was a very, very attractive place for people that were on the losing side to come and hide out for a while. Some people stayed, most went home.
Brian, I live in Niagara-on-the-Lake, and I didn't know the history of some houses that are just down the street from me. The one on Mississauga Street housed a very important person in the Confederacy.
Well, J.W. Avery was not just important in the Confederacy, but he was also a top dog of the Ku Klux organization of South Carolina. He was wanted for murder and terrorism. And in fact, while on trial on these federal charges under the Ku Klux Act of 1871, some friends put some horses outside the courtroom, and he escaped on a horse, made his way out of the country, and eventually made his way to London here. And then because he heard about Niagara-on-the-Lake and some of the generals and some of the other people that were there, he headed over to Niagara-on-the-Lake, and he actually owned a beautiful house that's there, and he owned it. He stayed longer, and upon his death many years later, he still actually owned the house in Niagara-on-the-Lake. I think because he was coming up from the south for to see the falls or just as a summer retreat. So yeah, J.W. Avery was he was a wanted man, the most wanted man in the United States. $60,000 was on his head.
That's incredible to think that that was going on right here in Niagara. Why do people not know more about this? We know about the history of the Underground Railroad, but a lot of people haven't heard of some of this history.
Well, actually, right beside John Breckinridge, who was the last Secretary of War and had been Vice President of the United States before the Civil War, he lived in two properties on Front Street. And one of his neighbors in the second property was the publisher of the Niagara newspaper, William Kirby. And he wrote a lot of sympathetic articles about the Confederates that were in their midst. And so some people did know about it. There was a very sympathetic newspaper publisher that did tell people about it, but I think that's been lost to history a lot. And people in Niagara-on-the-Lake, I'm sure, will have their eyes opened to learn how many Confederates were in their midst. There's some cemeteries for Black people, and they were there. But by the time the Confederate generals moved in, a lot of the former slaves and the Black people had moved on to get a little farther away from the border because of bounty hunters that were trying to return them to their owners down in the States.
And that Kirby house I'm familiar with, it's right across the street from the NOTL Golf Club.
And most importantly, for Breckinridge's purpose, he lived at, that was 120 Front Street, at 80 Front Street. The old captain's house was where he lived first, and he could hear. This is the former vice president of the United States, who was a wanted man in the States after the war. as Secretary of War, the last one for the Confederacy, he could hear the bugle call in the morning at Fort Niagara, waking the American soldiers up. He was that close to the Americans, and he was on the side of the border that was safe for him to otherwise, had he gone back to the States, he could have been tried for, sedition, being a traitor or something, and executed. So he could hear tantalizingly close the American military people who would have loved to have got their hands on him.
So fascinating, Brian. This book is available through ECW Press. Thank you so much for joining us today. I wish we had more time to talk about it.
Thanks, Mike. It's been a pleasure. Thank you, sir.